So I really appreciate you coming here tonight and supporting the women's ministry at Summit Drive. I couldn't think of a better place to be on a Friday night together. And I have to admit that I'm really nervous to talk, and I really appreciate that card that you handed out, because it reminds me that you might be doing something funny with the mic. Let me know. It's good. Yeah, so that card is really important because it reminds me that it's not about my feelings, and that it's okay to feel nervous or feel however I feel, and that in spite of that, it's really important that I go forward and I do what God is asking me to do. And He's asked me to come here tonight and share with you some really intimate details of my life. And I trust God 100% and fully, so I know that if you're here for a reason. So let's just get started. First I just want to pray that the eyes and the ears of your heart would be open, and that anything that I say would be Holy Spirit filled, and that it would help to glorify God and help us to love one another. And I'll just present my life to you here as a living sacrifice in hopes of honoring God further and maybe touching you, or we'll see how it goes. So I was born in Fort St. John as a baby. And my first encounter with Christ, it happened when I was about 3 or 4 years old. My family was moving south down to Prince George, and I went to a church with my mom. I came from a really atheist family who everybody besides my mother was actually very hostile towards Jesus, towards Christianity, towards God in general. But for some reason, my mother felt moved to take me to Sunday school when I was about 3 or 4 years old. And these were really fond memories. I didn't understand Jesus or Christianity intellectually at the time, but I believe a really important seed was planted in my soul. So over time, our family ended up coming south to Kamloops, and we thought it was a pretty strange place with tumbleweeds blowing around and the extreme heat, but we grew to love it. And it was here in this, let's say, especially at that time in the early 90s, Kamloops was a very sports-oriented kind of jock culture. And that was a bit of a culture shock for our family, because I came from a very eccentric family that wasn't interested in any sort of sports or sort of keeping up with the Joneses in that sort of way. So God started to shape me and give me some challenging experiences from a pretty young age. And I sort of see this as grist for my mill, right? How God uses it to turn all things into good. He uses my adversity or my challenging experiences. One of these first experiences I remember was being, on my 7th birthday, I handed out invitations to all the girls in my class, and nobody showed up. It was kind of sad. But at the same time, even at that time, at a really young age, I had a sense of, okay, this sucks. I'm feeling kind of bummed about it, but it's okay. It's okay. Things like this happen. And this was kind of the theme of my life, where God decided He wanted to teach me humility from a pretty young age. And I was sort of the artsy, intellectual, very emotional child. And because of that, I didn't always fit in very well in school. You know, there was bullying. There's things like that. But in spite of the difficulty there, I was blessed with such an amazing mother who was soft and kind-hearted in the same way that I was. And so there was a lot of love there, and I really wanted to say thanks for God for putting me in the family that He did. So it's very important that I make clear how hostile my family was towards God and Christianity. Regularly, my brothers, my father, people would just bash Jesus, make fun of it, make it like it was the worst thing in the world to be a Christian. And then, when I was about 10 years old, God decided that a neighbor would bring me to this church, to the Vacation Bible School there in about 1995. And I'll never forget it. It was in this room, and it was a Western kind of farm theme, and we danced and sang. And I was a very naive and sentimental child, so it was a really nice experience to me. And I found that the comfort of the church really warmed my heart. especially because out there in the real world, I found things to be very cynical and sarcastic and harsh, especially because my family, they're the type, bless their hearts, I love them and they gave me a lot, but one thing about them is that they're devout scientists and they worship science in this interesting way where things can be a little bit cold, a little bit harsh, and that just wasn't my nature. So I'll always remember the experience of this church at a young age and just feeling like, hey, these people are loving and warm and they're not being sarcastic. This feels really nice. But I didn't vocalize anything to my family. I was scared. And I never really asked to go to church, but again, I held that experience pretty dear inside of me. So I went on and I reached puberty and entered high school, and at this time, I was a straight A student, except for PE. I always got a G for effort, but often did quite poorly. I wasn't blessed in that way. Again, one of the ways that God chose to humble me. But I was really interested in arts, and I played in the band, and I did really well. And I started in high school like that, and I did well in academics and in arts. But somehow, overnight, something really weird happened. You know how parents talk about teenagers' brains, like all of a sudden just goes crazy? Well, I decided that I want to be part of the cool kids, and I was willing to do anything to get it. And I got completely swept up in mainstream culture, and I sacrificed my integrity for popularity. And it's like all of that humility that I experienced as a kid just left me like desperate to be approved and get the attention of the popular people in high school. So I turned to an eating disorder. I decided that, oh, I can't be this chubby bender, nobody's gonna like me then. So I developed anorexia and bulimia, did a lot of exercising, and it was just a mess in that way. And then I combined that with, there's a history of alcoholism in my family. I'm an extremely sensitive person. I couldn't really handle the harshness of the world, and especially in high school, and I started to drink. I started to use drugs. And things went downhill really, really quick. That's another theme of my life, is that things happen fast and very intensely. So I started to drown a lot of my feelings in alcohol, and at this time I was about 14 years old. I just started grade 9, and I drank in excess. I would black out. It was very scary. My parents were horrified. They hadn't had this, I was the youngest of 4 kids, and they hadn't had any trouble with their other children. We were raised in a middle-class home where my parents were very good to me, and it wasn't expected. We'll just say that, right? It wasn't. So it actually led to the point of me dropping out of school. I took things too far. I lost my popularity with the cool kids. I got labeled a slut and had all sorts of names like that thrown at me. And my little ego at the time, not knowing at all that I had a friend in Jesus Christ, that I had this God human that came and had a personal relationship with me. I had no idea about any of this. So I was totally at the whims of just the harshness of all of it. And I decided I couldn't take high school anymore. I just couldn't take it. It was killing me. So I begged my parents to let me drop out of high school and seek an alternative way to get my schooling. And I ended up at a place called Pathfinders. You guys might, some of you might remember it. It was the alternative for people who couldn't complete high school. And this was in this would have been in like 1999 or something. And it was at this location that I met people who were doing even more drugs, who were doing harder drugs, and I started using crystal meth. I had no idea what I was getting into. It's what the popular people were doing, and my heart was hurting. My heart was hurting so much, and I had no idea that there was a better way to deal with it, so I jumped right in. And at this point, things got especially bad. Like I say, it went really, really fast. And I really feel for my mother at this time, especially because she is so tender-hearted, and I was her baby, and it was something that really, really affected her. So, and it was so quick. It was like 1 minute, I'm in the car with her, we're singing along to Andrew Lloyd Webber musicals, I'm this band geek, and then the next minute, I'm wearing incredibly provocative clothing, huge face full of makeup, and I'm leaving for days on end and not telling her where I'm going. And this was another one of those grist for my mill experiences, and not just for me, but for my mother, because it actually brought her much more into the church and into Christianity in a serious way. because she was experiencing so much anxiety about what I was going through that she went to her doctor and she said, what do I do? And her doctor happened to be a fellow who comes to this church. His name's Dr. Delvagio. And he, so much gratitude for him. He saved my life at least twice. And he suggested to my mother that it wasn't just a medical problem and that maybe she could try a spiritual pursuit. And she started coming to this church. She started coming to Summit Tribe Church, and she took the Alpha course then, and she got involved. And I mean, what else could she do? She was so powerless. And she tried everything. She would ground me and try to keep me at home, and I would just sneak out the window. There's nothing she could do short of putting me in a straitjacket and tying me down to stop me. And at this point, it was almost like I was possessed by something in my brain, you know? I hated my mom. I thought she was lame. I hated that she wasn't going to let me go out and just party with my friends and do whatever I wanted. And I was just hell-bent on being cool and getting the rush that you get from these drugs, these hard drugs that I was using. But fortunately, I got really sick. Okay, at this time, I think my mom was praying for me fervently, and I imagine Dr. Delvagio was too, and perhaps even other members of this church. Never underestimate the power of prayer for people, please. It's just amazing. So what happened was I got so sick that Dr. Delvagio had to hospitalize me. I think I had pneumonia or something. I was literally smoking a package of cigarettes a day, snorting and smoking crystal meth when I was 14 years old, so it's really damaged my little lungs. So I was put in the hospital in the children's ward, and what this did was it forced me to get off drugs. So I cleaned up, and it was a really formative experience. I had the people that were, the roommates that were with me in the hospital were exactly who God needed me to see, and it was really important. Like, for example, one of the women in the hospital, one of these young girls, she was 17, in the bed across from me. I've never seen somebody who was so depressed. You see, when I was using, there was times when I tried to commit suicide. I would take a bunch of pills. I was really dissatisfied with life, and I wanted to die. And in this hospital room, when I was there was a woman who was drinking and driving. And she was the driver of the car. And she killed her boyfriend and her best friend, who were in the car with her. And then she was so distraught with herself that she went and took her car and put it in front of a train to try to commit suicide, but she lived. And she was missing both of her legs and one of her arms. And I have never seen somebody so depressed in my entire life as this woman. Bless her heart, God, I don't know where she is right now, but please just surround her with so much love and comfort. But this was a really, really, really important wake-up call for what I was dabbling in and the consequence that it could have had. God is so gracious that way, right? That he opens my eyes. So I left the hospital, I cleaned up, I stopped using these drugs, and I was still kind of stupid though. Okay, here's the thing. So I still went back into it and I started using drugs again. Well, before I started using drugs again, I remember going back to the home that I was using it in, and it was this dirty, filthy kind of home where there was young people, like 6-year-olds, smoking marijuana. All the adults in the house were doing drugs, were drunk constantly all day long. And at this time, I had some perspective about the place that I was in, and I thought, what am I doing here? I have this comfortable middle-class home to go to. Why did I come back here, and why am I doing this? And one of the reasons why that happened was that there was a really, really important thing that my mom did. And I really want to stress this for anybody who might be dealing with someone who's got someone out there in the world using drugs or whatever they're doing, is that my mom dealt with it in a way that was so Christ-like. When I was using drugs and I was in that home and I was staying out all night and not coming home, my mom wouldn't punish me per se, but what she would do was she fought for me. So she would sit outside of that place that she was terrified to go to. My mother was never used to any sort of this kind of lifestyle at all. She would get my older brother and they would sit in their van and they would park vigilantly outside of the house praying for me and waiting. And I was horrified, right? Like everyone in the house is like, who's this sober woman outside who's knocking on the door? And they just laughed in my mom's face, right? And it's difficult. What do you do in that situation? She called the police, but the police can't necessarily do anything, right? So what did she do when she was powerless? She showed up, she showed me that she loved me, and this is where I got my first taste of God's grace. I didn't get what I deserved, or his mercy, his mercy. I didn't get what I deserved, right? My mom could have put me in jail. I stole from them, I lied to them. She could have put me in foster care. And those are the kind of things that a lot of other parents did for the friends of mine when I was experiencing this kind of turmoil. And I understand, his parents were desperate. I'm sure I will understand one day when my kids turn into teenagers. But I really want to encourage you in this way that my mother's approach of not taking the heavy-handed punishment, but showing up and showing me that I mattered, really affected me deeply. Because during that time, I didn't care enough about myself. I didn't know about Christ. So my mother, in showing up and standing vigil and telling me that she loved me anyway, was almost a punishment in and of itself, because it increased the level of guilt that I felt so much. So much. So I just want to present that to you as an option if you have a son or daughter or a loved one who's struggling in that area, that there is a way to mix equal parts truth and love and not necessarily be super heavy-handed in the punishment, and that this could go even further. Because if my mom had just punished me and said, that's it, you're out of here, it would have just triggered my rebelliousness even more. But the fact that she just completely showed up for me in that way really changed things. It was a game changer. And I believe that's a big part of the reason why I got out of this. I've heard it said, I don't know if this statistic is still true, I've heard it said that the average crystal meth user will die within 7 years of using the drug. It's an incredible, deadly drug, and I was very, very blessed in that way that I was able to come off of it completely, and especially because of the help of my mother. And I decided that enough was enough. I was going to completely stop this, and I joined the 12-step program. And this is where my relationship with God grew even further. Some of you might be familiar with 12-step programs. They're very centered on God. Because of some of the baggage that a lot of folks have with the idea of a Christian God, they changed the word to higher power. But the whole program and these things called the 12 steps that you work through, they're really, they're all based on Christianity and based on the Bible. So this is where, still no mention of Jesus Christ, but where I started to develop prayer and really understanding God in my life, and that he had carried me through all those hard times. And I did well. I cleaned up, and I started to sponsor other girls, young girls that were in addiction, and I would go to conventions, and it was really wonderful. But even though I was happy, and I was healthy, and I was clean, there was still this gnawing in my heart and my soul, and I wasn't totally content. So while working through one of the sets of steps that I did this thing called a fourth step. You might hear there's kind of jokes about this, that, oh, you got to work your fourth step. It's kind of a scary thing, because it's where you go through a moral inventory of everything you've done in your life, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and you share it with your sponsor. It's kind of like a mentor, and you share it with God. So during this time, I shared with very calm, kind of run-of-the-mill way, I told her how I had some resentments toward the men that I had sex with during active addiction. And my sponsor stopped me, and she informed me that what I casually described as unpleasant sexual encounters with aggressive men was actually rape, and it was something called sexual assault, and that I probably needed to go to sexual assault counseling. So at that point, I didn't realize that. I thought, okay, I'm the idiot that put myself in those situations. I brought myself around all these unsavory characters. I got myself blackout drunk. I thought it was my own fault. And this woman guided me, and she said, you know, I think you need some counseling in this way. So I did. I started to do some sexual assault counseling, and it was really good in many ways. It's helped me to understand that a lot of my self-identity had been formed in this way, where I thought my entire self-worth came from being sexually available to men, and in my appearance and the way that I had looked. And it helped me unpack some of these untrue ideas about my identity. But it was, you know, secular-based counseling, and there wasn't a focus on the spiritual piece of it. And without that healing, without Jesus Christ in my life, I still couldn't get that full healing. But what did happen to me in this time was I got highly politicized. And this is where I want to be really careful, because I'm going to talk a bit about feminism, and I think it's really important to just pay a lot of respect for feminism, and that this is a huge, broad word, and there's so many different kinds of people that are in this movement who have totally different ways of doing things. And I want to make it really clear that I totally support the premise of feminism. I do. In terms of the fact, and we know this as women, we are not treated equally in our culture, and that there is a lot working against us, and that that takes a multitude of forms, and that when you look at the intersection of race and class and body shape and ability and all these different things, that this is a problem, and we do live in a society that's not very equal. But and I'll get into this, I get into my stories, so I agree with the premise of feminism, but I don't necessarily agree with a lot of the tactics, with the way of carrying out justice, at least how it turned out for me. So I became politicized while getting this sexual assault counseling, and I started going to these feminist upstart meetings. And I started to learn, I was also entering university, and I started to take things from political science and sociology and gender studies, and I did it through this lens of radical liberal politics. And at this time, the year was about 2004, and identity politics weren't popular like they are now. It was very different. It was a very fringe kind of thing, especially here in Kamloops. But it was something that really spoke to my heart as someone who had experienced adversity, and a child who was incredibly sensitive and felt very angry with the cruel injustices of this world. I felt very excited to be a part of this movement, the social justice movement. I thought, great, finally, something I can do to help the world be not such a cruel place. So I jumped right in. And at this time, especially as a child, I was a pretty meek and shy person. I was pretty introverted, I was very sensitive. But over time, as I grew and as I went into this movement, I became very emboldened. And I became very angry in many ways. And there was a certain way that interpreted what happened to me, the rape experiences that I went through, with a way that wasn't Christ-like, that wasn't forgiving, but that was angry, kind of march in the streets, kind of protest way. And I understand feeling that way. I've got to say, you're going to see that it didn't turn out well. So while I was progressing down this political route and doing a lot of protesting in the street and very angry kind of stuff, but also a lot of good stuff too, a lot of passionate, helping people, being very compassionate, both of that. But I also got involved in drugs again. I was terrified of hard drugs, so I stayed away from that, but I started to use pot and alcohol. And again, I just totally fell victim to the world out there and tried to be cool, and just, you know, the university radical social justice thing is to have sex with random people, to smoke drugs, to smoke marijuana, to drink, to do that kind of thing. So, in many ways I succeeded. I became very popular, and I did very well in school in spite of the fact that I was using drugs and alcohol. I was a really good student, and my professors and my peers admired me, and I had many prominent positions. I was on the board of governors, and I was on the student union, and I did a lot of service work, and I knew a lot of administrators in the university. But I think one thing that's important to mention here is just, I don't know if you guys know about the young adults group that meets here on Monday nights, but I just feel really moved to talk about them. And because when I was in university, so much of that experience was full of pride and drugs and sex and interpreting the world with this sort of secular, radical, kind of liberal lens. And there's some good stuff there, but there's some really rotten stuff there too. So I feel it's really important that we support our young adults group here at Summit Drive, and I know a lot of you already do, and I just want to encourage you to keep doing that, because I feel that when I first came to that young adults group, I literally fell to my knees and I wept, because I couldn't believe that there was young adults that weren't cynical and trying to be cool and just indulging in all this drugs and sex, and that there was young adults who came to break bread and worship and talk to each other about the gospel, and it's something that really warms my heart. So please support them with prayer, making food for them, or just however you can. Because I really believe that the enemy especially likes to attack our young adults. Because I feel like in the spiritual war that we're in the midst of here, the young adults are kind of on the front line as they go through this very vulnerable period of going from children to adults. So it's very important that we equip them with the armor of God, because without it, they are defenseless. And in my case, I'm going to tell you this, I was beltless and barefoot, no truth, no gospel of peace, and I was ravaged in this spiritual war, right? So back to my university experience, I was hostile towards Christians, openly hostile towards Christians. I adopted my family's belief, and it's really cool to make fun of Christians out there in the real world. And some of you maybe are so beautifully innocent in this area that you might not realize it because you're not a part of these groups, but I think it's important to realize that. So at one time, I was actually running for the student union, or the whole slate of student union candidates at TRU, with a social justice theme, and we ran against another slate of candidates who were openly Christian. And oh, did we ever make fun of them. We ruthlessly tormented them solely for being Christians. I even remember getting drunk and prank calling them and making gay jokes to them for being Christians. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I really didn't. And I was an awful person, totally wretched. But God was in charge, because we ended up losing the election by a landslide, and the better people won that night. And through the grace of God, and through Christ, and his power of mercy and forgiveness, the person that I actually ran against, the woman I ran against, is a member of this church. And in becoming a Christian, I've been able to reach out to her and make amends to her, and she's been so gracious. She's so wonderful with accepting my apology. So it's very important that we know and we understand that there is no sin that's too big to overcome with Christ. Exactly, it's a finished work on the cross. It is done. Praise God, because no sin is too big for the power of Jesus' blood. Yes, exactly. And not even murder, right? And that's kind of the next place I'm going. This is another low point in my university career, my abortion, right? So I was in between boyfriends, and I was totally devastated. My ex-boyfriend broke up with me, and I was at the student union conference where I was out of town, and I was staying in a hotel room next to the men that I had worked with, and I overheard them talking about how difficult it was to work with me, because I was such an emasculating woman, and they couldn't stand it, because I was just so aggressive in my way. And I was heartbroken. I didn't know that even when people in this world weren't for me, that there was someone else who was for me, that Jesus Christ was for me, and he was there for me. So, totally overcome with grief, I went out, I got drunk, I met some random man, I brought him back into my hotel room, and he brought some marijuana, and we actually went to the Bible, those Gideon Bibles that they leave in hotels. I ripped page 420 out of the Bible, which is the 420 is the international number for pot smoking. We rolled up a marijuana cigarette and we smoked it with that page of the Bible. And then I had sex with that man. I got pregnant from it. And I was horrified. Like, I mean, for some of you who know me, you know that I love babies, I love children, and I've always been inclined that way. I've done a lot of babysitting, a lot of childcare in my life. So this was kind of a devastating thing for me because I really wanted to have a baby, but I just felt that my identity as this radical, feminist, academic totally didn't jive with being pregnant and having a baby at this time. So, and everybody around me just said, well, what do you mean? You have to get an abortion. I mean, if you keep this baby, that's selfish. You've been smoking pot and drinking, and you just want to keep this baby because you want something to love you. And you're a little kid yourself, and what about your political career? What about everything that you're doing? How can you keep this baby? not thinking about the man at all and that he had any rights. And again, I was very emboldened by this feminist movement in this way. I thought, my body, my choice. I didn't know that my body belonged to Christ. I didn't know. So I believed all of the lies, and I thought it was my moral duty to abort my baby. And when I'm really honest, I just wanted to be the good, radical feminist. And I wanted to keep the approval of my professors and my peers. So I thought I had to do this. And I didn't think much of it either. I had no idea that this was a morally wrong thing to do, because all I ever heard was pro-choice. So I went to go to it, and my mom's so amazing. This woman is so amazing. She was very supportive of me during this time. And she made it so clear to me. She told me something very different than everyone else. She said, Heather, you just need to know that you can drop out of school, you can move in with Dad and I, we will 100% support you. You can be a single unwed mother, it doesn't matter. We will support you financially, we will support you. You do not have to have an abortion. She was so great about it. But she also didn't tell me that I wasn't allowed to have an abortion. It was really, really important for my mom that I made this choice for myself, but she made it very easy and very comfortable for me to have an abortion, or for me to not have an abortion, right? She would have held my hand the whole way, totally supported me to have that child. But again, just like when I was a teenager, I wasn't following my mom. I was following the ways of the world. And I wanted to be cool, and I wanted the esteem of continuing in my political career. So I said no, and it was difficult to get one, honestly, an abortion at the time, because you couldn't get very much in Canada. Not a lot of doctors would have performed it. If I would have had it here, I would have been beyond the legal limit of being allowed to do it. So I had to go to Vancouver. I went to a women's clinic there to go do it, and I will never forget, on the drive down there, we're going over the Port Mann Bridge. My mom, she had to drive me there. You need someone else to take you. And she says to me, Heather, you don't have to do this. We can turn around right now and go home. You don't have to do this. You could tell she probably didn't want me to do it, right? Like, that was in her heart that she did. She also loves babies. That's where I learned it from, right? She had 4 children. So, and this is where I just need to be really clear. At that time, I said to my mom, no, I have to do it. And I chose to kill the baby inside of me, right? God gave me free will, and I used it to murder my unborn child. It's what I did. And it was so easy. It was painless, informal procedure. A trip to the dentist was more cumbersome. I thought nothing of it at the time. When I went back to my life of drugs, alcohol, and sex, and politics, I didn't feel guilty at all. I thought I had every right to kill the baby, not tell anything to the father. I was very prideful and filled up of all of this feminist rhetoric out there, right? My body, my choice. I didn't know that my body and everything inside of it belonged to Christ. And it wasn't until years later that I became a Christian and was in this church that, after my traumatic conversion, which I'll get to into a personal relationship with Christ, that I realized I had done something wrong. I'll never forget sitting in this church when Dave did a sermon on the consequence of sexual sin, and another member of the church putting her hand on me and comforting me, as I just cried my eyes out, realizing what I had done years later. And I shared about the abortion that I had during my baptism. I don't know if any of you were here, but I openly shared about that. And this is where I need to give so much gratitude and thanks and praise for the members of this church, because I'm telling you, I told people that I had an abortion. At that time, I hadn't even clued in that it was murder. I actually said during my baptism that murder was the only sin I hadn't done, but said that I had had an abortion. And not a single person came up to me and spoke any ill will to me. Nobody harshly corrected me on that, not a single person. You, the people of Summit Drive Church, have done nothing but hug me, smile at me, and welcome me here with open arms. And that is very important, because on my own, I came to the realization that I had murdered and that that was something I had done. And that was more powerful. Just like the mercy that my mother had shown me. You showed me that. You didn't give me what I deserved. You didn't give me the harshness that I deserved for doing that. And in a way that almost made it worse, because I knew what I had done, and you guys just loved me anyway and loved me through it. And I praise you all for living as real Christians, just the way that Jesus would have done. Right? This is from the Summit Drive website. The followers of Jesus Christ should seek to love everyone they come in contact with. And love identifies us as true disciples of Jesus. And you really are true disciples of Jesus here. And you were so welcoming to me. And I just want to take a moment right now to ask you if there's anything inside of you, or are you not as welcoming of yourself? Do you guys notice that sometimes it's easier to extend that kind of welcome, forgiveness to other people than it is to yourself? And after boldly sharing with you the depths of my wretchedness and my sin, I just want to ask, is there anything that you're holding on to about yourself? Is there some sin that you've committed? Is there some resentment or unforgiveness that you have inside of you that you're holding on to, that you're not allowing the full power of Jesus and what he did on the cross to completely wipe your slate clean? Is there some area of your life that you haven't completely and fully surrendered to Jesus Christ, to allow his full-on powers of healing, redemption to completely fill you up and heal you? If you haven't accessed his grace and mercy, and there's something holding you back, I really want to encourage you here. And you would just take a moment here in silence before I finish my testimony to consider that, prayerfully consider it. Lord, I just pray that every single woman in this room and every person on earth would come to their knees with any unconfessed sin and have the total and complete confidence that the good Lord forgives all that we repent for. Nothing is too big, because the death of Jesus Christ on the cross, that fateful spring day, conquered all sins. It's done. And if we're not forthcoming with our transgressions, we can't be washed away. And when we're honest with all that we have done, that's when we can awaken to a new life with a friend in Jesus Christ. And you guys know this. You've probably done this a million times. I don't need to tell you, maybe. And Lord, I just pray that by boldness and confessing this sin, and this is actually being videotaped right now because some people wanted to see it who couldn't be here too. So not just you folks, but everybody who might end up listening to this. I pray that my boldness in confessing my selfish, self-serving, self-seeking nature that resulted in the murder of my unborn child would inspire others to boldly go forward and humbly go forward to confess any unrepentant sin so that we can be fully washed clean in the blood of Jesus Christ and stand totally blameless and holy as his bride, vigilantly waiting for our bridegroom. Because that's what it's all about, right? You guys taught me this. I didn't know until I came here. So, during this time, I had developed a real spiritual sense. It started with the 12-step program, and it really grew in sort of this New Age movement. I was really into New Age and indigenous spirituality and Buddhism and Hinduism and all that kind of stuff. So I became a very spiritual person in that way, right? But the trouble is there's many, many false ideas about what it means to know God. And I thought I could get to know God through taking hallucinogenics and doing transcendental meditations. And these certainly are tactics that open us up to the spiritual realm. But within that spiritual realm, there's good and there's evil. I don't even believe in evil until very recently. The God that I knew and the Jesus that I heard about out there, well, he was a loving hippie who embraced everyone and everything, and there was no such thing as hell, and everybody was going to heaven. And God brought me to a very interesting form of hell on earth to show me the truth, right? And if it could get any more intense, it does. Please bear with me here. So after the abortion, I got into a very passionate relationship with another man. I really tried to drown my sorrows in that relationship. And this man was very physically abusive towards me. It was a very difficult relationship. And I finally ended it. I got out of that relationship, and I became very depressed after that. And at this point, I decided I'm a lesbian. I don't have to be with men. They rape me, they beat me, I can't do it. And it was very politically convenient to do that as well, right? I'm a feminist, that looked really good. That's it, I swore off men. And I also became disillusioned in academia, in politics. I dropped out of school in my last semester. I ended up getting a degree anyway. Apparently I had enough credits to do it, but I just said, no, I don't want it. And I was offered a really high-paying job in politics, and I just was done with the whole thing. And I ended up giving up my house and put my stuff in storage, and I went and lived on a farm. I thought, that'll save me. Let's get out of the city, I'll be a farmer. So I joined the woofer movement, this organic farming thing where I traded my labor for room and board, and I lived in a tent in kind of like next to the chicken coop with the chickens. And it was beautiful. I learned a lot. It was really good to do that. It was super scary, and it was amazing. And it was at this point that I met my future husband. And I just have to say, so I've been talking about him a lot right now, really personally, because it's true, you become one flesh. And our journey of knowing Jesus Christ really personally is a very personal and intimate story. As if it couldn't get any more intimate and personal than I already have, it does. So please, just bear with me here. But I want to say that this is, all of this, my husband knows that I'm going to say this. I have his permission, and he totally supports me in this, and he is on his own journey with Christ and healing from his own self-centeredness. We all have it in our heart, and I just don't want this to come across as though this is slander or harsh towards him. I love my husband, and he is growing a lot and has changed a lot in this, but it's just, you're going to see it's important. So here we go. I met this man, and I thought I was a lesbian, like I said, but he took one look at me and he said, you're not a lesbian, you're just doing that because it's politically convenient. And he was totally right. So, and I was really smitten with this guy. He seemed to have a refreshing sense of masculinity, right? He wasn't as aggressive as the other men I know, so I pursued things with him. And he seemed really interested in me too. But there was this sense that I got that something wasn't right. And I confronted him on it early on in our relationship, and I just said, I don't get it. You seem so into me. Why do you also play kind of cool and aloof? And he admits, he says, well, Heather, I do really like you and I really care about you, but this relationship is hard for me because he came from a much higher class background than I did. He came from a wealthy family in upper class Toronto, and I came from this like forester, kind of weird eccentric family from Kamloops. And it was hard. He really liked me. It's like he could see my spirit, but he had a hard time with the package that it came in. He was very judgmental of my tattoos. He was judgmental of my weight and the shape of my body. He was judgmental that I didn't use proper grammatically correct sentences. And it was a really, really difficult time because when he admitted all of this to me, he triggered my deepest wound from childhood. This idea that I was somehow morally defective and totally inadequate as a human being because I was fat and unsophisticated. And I was so confused. If he felt this way, then why was he dating me? Was this some sort of cruel joke or something? All the childhood bullying flooded back to me, especially a traumatic rape incident that happened in my youth where two adult men brought me, my intoxicated 14-year-old self, back to their home. And they told me how, they lured me and they told me how beautiful and articulate I was. And then while they raped me, they simultaneously told me that I was fat, that I was ugly, and that I was never going to have a relationship with an honorable man. This is a very, very damaging thing. And now, this man that I'm dating is triggering this wound inside of me. And I thought, how did this man that I so recently began dating know my deepest insecurity? Is he somehow in cahoots with my old rapists? How is this happening? But no, of course, he had no idea anything about my history. He was actually expressing his own deep insecurities and childhood wounds, and he was totally ignorant of anything I went through. But God knew everything, and he brought us together for a reason. Like two interlocking pieces of a puzzle, each of us penetrating into one another's darkest, unhealed wounds. And it's my understanding of the good Lord that he loves us so much that he wants us to heal from the toxic and cruel nature of both our own hearts and the world around us. And real healing often does not come without some level of pain. And I'm sure that you may have noticed this in your own intimate relationships, that you met people who trigger your own gaping childhood wounds. And this is no coincidence. This is a very special opportunity for healing. So an incredibly painful and passionate relationship ensued with this man, with equal parts joy to sorrow. We were madly in love with each other, but we had no instruction from the Bible. We had no moral guideline. And Stephen's judgments towards me got very harsh. He would be verbally abusive towards me in this way. And I got puffed up with my own arrogance and self-righteousness, so influenced by the feminist teachings, but really it was ultimately my own toxic, arrogant heart. I would react to Stephen's callousness and cruelty with rage. I didn't have wisdoms from Proverbs 12:16. The vexation of a fool is known at once, but the prudent ignores an insult. I don't know how to ignore the insult, and I felt entitled to be angry with what my husband was doing to me, but I also was madly in love with him. I couldn't just break up with him. So it's a very toxic relationship in that way, and I was completely foolish. So I defended myself, and I told him about my rape experiences and my bullying experiences as a kid, and I told him that I needed to be treated with more respect, and that he needed to stop putting me down in this way, and I absolutely needed tenderness because of what I'd been through. But I did it not always in a very soft way. I would say that in a pretty aggressive way. So he was offended by my rage, by my yelling, so he couldn't even address the issues that I asked him to. Instead, he was reeling from his own childhood trauma of emotional neglect, so he couldn't be of service to me. And we were both in the corners, licking our own wounds, consoling ourselves. Right? If only I had had Paul's timeless advice to the Philippians in 2 verses 3 to 4, where he says, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourself. And let each of you look not only to his own interests, but to the interests of others." I didn't have that wisdom, so instead we spent thousands of dollars, like all of Stephen's savings, on self-help, New Age, yoga, meditation, counseling, everything under the sun, to cure us of our volatile vengeance for one another. And we would find some relief, and we'd go through periods of peace between us. And during one of these longer times of peace, I got pregnant with our first child. And we were blessed with a beautiful daughter, a healthy baby. And things seemed good on the surface of our relationship. At this time, I was using very little marijuana, I wasn't drinking, and I was very excited to become a mother. But as the reality of having that new baby set in, the tensions began to rise, and I had gained a lot of weight in that pregnancy. And this created a lot of anxiety between Stephen and I. And I got the feeling that Stephen was kind of doing it again. And then he did. He started to express his dissatisfaction with my body and put me down in that way. And tell me that actually the whole time that I was pregnant, he was often fantasizing about other women and thinking about pornography. You see, he had had a pornography addiction. He had found pornography when he was 4 years old as a boy in his family home, and it was something that really, really deeply affected him. So, I was a vulnerable new mother, didn't have any of the Holy Spirit in me, did not have a friend in Jesus, and I lost it on my husband. I could not believe that he would hold the natural changing of a woman's body through pregnancy against me in such a cruel way. How could he judge so harshly the belly that was home to his precious daughter? Again, it was all about me. It was all about how could he do this to me? How could he do it to me? And so you've heard about trauma responses, fight, flight, or freeze. So when I was a teenager and I was raped, I was frozen. This time I'm all triggered, right? I got this post-traumatic stress disorder thing. And I fought him, and at this point I started to physically beat my husband for putting me through this, right? And our baby was exposed to this. Our anger was never directed at her, but she was a witness to the abuse, which is a kind of violence in and of itself. And I have a journal entry from the first time that we exposed our daughter to this violence. I was devastated and disgusted with myself. I decided I needed to trap my explosive emotions on the inside and just not deal with it so I could protect my daughter from seeing and in effect experiencing the trauma between my husband and I. But it would only work for so long, and I would inevitably explode on my husband again in rage. So in spite of all those years of diligently doing sexual assault counseling and completing every exercise I was given, I had not healed from my rape experiences. Well, the truth is that I did heal from those experiences. I fully forgave each one of my rapists and held absolutely no hard feelings towards them. And honestly, I would wash their feet right now with total love and joy if they were here. But what I couldn't forgive was my husband treating me that way. Those men were lost. They were, random men at parties. My husband was my husband. So, while I healed from those rape experiences, I had not healed from the fall from grace and the toxicity in my self-centered heart as a result. And I could not let my husband off the hook for hurting me so deeply. And bereft of the life-giving love of Christ Jesus, I relied too much on my husband's love, and I turned into a vengeful wreck when he withheld that love. And many would justify my anger towards him. I knew feminists that were advocating beating and humiliating men who committed rape and other sexist transgressions, failing to see that an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. Because defense is the first act of war. And that's what Jesus meant when he said to turn the other cheek. Because if somebody attacks you and you don't attack back, then it's over. There's no fight. There's nothing but peace. Defense is always the first act of war, right? So, and Timothy Keller explains it very well in his book, The Meaning of Marriage, which really saved my husband's and my life. He says, all people need to be treated gently and respectfully, especially those who have been wounded, because they will be unusually sensitive to rough handling. Nevertheless, all people must be challenged to see that their self-centeredness hasn't been caused by the people who hurt them. It's only been aggravated by the abuse. And they must do something about it, or they're going to be miserable forever. So yes, I'd been the victim of rape, and my husband was being very cruel towards me. But just like Keller said, my self-centeredness, my sinful, toxic heart existed long before anybody did any harm to me. So yes, my husband's behavior, compounded by my old wounds, certainly aggravated things. But that was not the cause of my problem. Nor was my ex-boyfriend who physically abused me before Stephen, or my rapists, or any of that. It'd be very easy for me to blame these men for my anger and for my violence, but it would be living a lie. The truth is, I was the root of my own problem. And later on, with the help of my ultimate friend and defender, Jesus Christ, I could see the deep taproot of selfishness inside of me. That selfish ambition. And perhaps even some of you are thinking to yourself, oh, give yourself a break, Heather. As a rape victim and victim of all this physical abuse, you have the right to have selfish ambition. I've had people tell me that, but to this I say, aren't we supposed to invite Christ into every single aspect of our lives with no stone unturned? Which brings me to Psalm 139, verse 23 to 24. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any grievous ways in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. And I take this all really seriously, right? All this stuff that I read in the Bible. So, and even before I knew Christ, I began to learn some of these principles of total forgiveness in the New Age movement that I was a part of. But without Christ, I couldn't be fully healed from it. So here I was terrified of the monster I'd become, and I was desperate to do anything to stop it. I said, okay, if I lose weight, that'll stop it, right? So I obsessively started exercising. I got my eating disorder back again, and I did a whole bunch of yoga. We went to this thing called Yoga Boot Camp, where you exercise very diligently every morning, early in the morning, and I starved myself. I over-exercised. I got very little sleep. I lost a lot of weight very rapidly. And I felt morally superior, because instead of going to the gym, I did yoga. And the teacher would tell us, you're already beautiful, but she'd also charge us a lot of money to sweat and work and count every pound that we lost. And we'd sing these beautiful yoga mantras and talk about inner beauty. Meanwhile, desperate to lose weight and conform to the worldly ideal of female beauty. So I lost weight, and it didn't help. My husband was still just as harsh towards me as he was before. And now I was even more angry because I was starving, and I was tired, and I was putting all of this effort into exercising, and none of it worked. None of it did anything. It was worse. So I reached out to some friends. I was honest about what was happening, and I was violent towards my husband, and that my daughter, who was very young at this age, was witnessing it. So she called the Ministry of Children. Thank her so much. Bless you for doing this, for following her conscience. And we developed a file with the ministry, and we were really scared at first, but we were partly relieved. We wanted help so badly, and we'd spent all of our money on all of this counseling and all these other techniques. So we thought, okay, like, can they help us? And we got the limited resources that they were able to offer, and we did everything that they told us. They didn't remove our kids. They saw that we were very, very good parents in every other aspect, except for our children being exposed to the violence between us, and that we had never done it to them. And then, but there's still some problems. So I went even deeper into yoga. I became a yoga teacher, and I read all of the Buddhist Bibles and the Hindu Bibles, the Bhagavad Gita and the Sutras, and I went super deep in Eastern religion. I'm looking for anything, right? And some of this helped. Again, within that, there is some of the Christ-like things that we learn from the Bible, but it didn't fully help. So things got a bit better until I got pregnant with my second child, and that's when I got really, really sick. I had horrible nausea, and I was throwing up every day, constantly. It wasn't just morning sickness. So I started to use marijuana very heavily during my pregnancy to help me with the nausea. And things got even worse with my husband. He was going through a very dark time, and he became very, very cruel towards me. And I was ultra sensitive with the pregnancy, and the fighting between my husband and I got worse. And this is when I became suicidal. I just didn't want to live, and I attempted suicide several times during that pregnancy. And this is probably the most difficult time of my entire life. You've heard I've been through a lot. This is the worst. Every day was a struggle to live. The New Age Buddhist yoga teachings didn't give me any personal relationship with a human God, friend to turn to. And there was wisdom in those teachings, there was, although I believe it was stolen from the Bible. But without Jesus, there was no hope, and it was just a totally dark time. And in spite of my selfish attempts of suicide, I did give birth to this beautiful, healthy baby girl. And after pregnancy, even once the nausea ended, I continued to smoke pot a lot. By then I was really addicted to it. I was really using it to soothe myself and the issues that I'd gone through with my husband. And I started doing some very intense spiritual practices. I started doing a lot of shamanistic rituals. I did this thing called Kundalini Yoga, really big time. And these were very, very deep spiritual rituals, right? And I kind of started to go a bit nuts. And at the time, I thought it was a spiritual awakening, or what's referred to as this thing called Kundalini rising, which literally means a serpent uncoils from the base of your spine, descends up your chakras, energetic centers within the physical and metaphysical body, until this serpent energy explodes out of your crown into the expansiveness of the celestial realm. And I felt great. I was high-flying. And I could perform incredible physical feats, like jumping several feet in the air and running in length for incredible distances. I was feeling very loving and passionate towards people. I was on fire. I thought I had this higher consciousness, and I thought the universe was telling me the secrets of human existence. And I would often lecture Stephen on all my spiritual awakenings. But then something very odd happened. During this heightened sense of the supernatural, I heard a song. It deeply affected me. I felt that God was speaking to me. That song was Mrs. Robinson by Simon and Garfunkel. Because I'm Mrs. Robinson, I never took my husband's last name. You know, here's to you, Mrs. Robinson. Jesus loves you more than you will know. I heard that song. And I was like, what? And it was a message from God. I felt that God was speaking to me directly, and I had no idea what the implications of this would be. But in that moment, I accepted Jesus Christ in my heart. And I decided that I needed to immediately become a Christian. It was that sudden and that odd. God told me that Jesus loved me. I listened and I obeyed. I had no idea how. I had no idea what this meant. I was still caught up with all the marijuana and the New Age mysticism. And remember, there's another Jesus out there. There's another Jesus in the New Age community. A whole other one. And the Bible warns us of this, right? That there's going to be false Christ. The one that's the hippie that loves everyone, right? So I was on fire for passion for God and for Jesus. And I began to make all these really zealous Facebook posts about God and Jesus and how much I love them. And there's this one post in particular that turned into this really long rant about the injustices facing Aboriginal women and the overwhelmingly high rates of violence and murder that they experience in this country. It was an issue that really touched my heart because as someone who got caught up in the drug addiction, I felt like often it was my white privilege that protected me somewhat, so I felt it was a very important issue to my heart. So I was making all these crazy Facebook posts, but maybe they were noble somewhat, but they were mostly self-indulgent, and I really wanted to get my husband's attention on it, and again, at this time he was very distancing himself from me and just being very aloof and didn't really want anything to do with me, and I did some crazy stunt. I locked him outside, forced him to read my Facebook post, and it was really cold outside, and I put a picture of it on Facebook, and I made it all public, and then the social workers saw this somehow, and my family had a file with them, so they showed up at our door, and they brought several police officers, and some of my friends had been talking to them, and these are friends that didn't believe in any sort of spirituality at all. They thought I'd gone completely insane. And away I had. So, social workers and these RCMP officers showed up at my house. And they'd also heard that I'd been suicidal. So they were very heavy-handed. And at this time, my baby was 3 months old. My other daughter was about 4, my husband. And they said they needed to take me to the emergency room. And it was all very confusing, and it was very vague about how it was going to go down. And somehow it ended up that I had to go with a police car. And at some point, I just decided I don't totally know how to explain it, but the way I understand it is that I was filled by the Holy Spirit at this point. Something about accepting Jesus Christ in my heart, I knew the right way to act, and I completely submitted to the authorities and obeyed them, and it was calm. So I went to the hospital. But my husband wasn't calm, and my kids weren't calm, and my parents who came down to the hospital were not calm. And they didn't know what the heck was going on, and nobody was really telling us, and it was all this kind of a weird thing. And eventually they ended up putting me in the isolation room of the emergency room, which is like a jail cell. And like as soon as they closed that door on me, I could feel like a visceral sense of light coming through me, and I was just completely calm. And it hadn't even, they did give me some drugs, some like really strong drugs, but they just given them to me, like it hadn't had time to take effect. It was different. And I found out that I had Christian friends that were praying for me because they saw the craziness on my Facebook posts. They were praying for me during this time. So I just had this totally calm, quiet inside of me, and somehow I knew that something really bad was happening with my kids. You can hear my baby crying. Because what happened was my parents and my husband were really freaking out. They were very upset. They didn't understand what was happening. And people at the hospital, they tried their best. They were very innocent in this, but there's no policy for what you do with a nursing mother who has a little baby. And there's confusion with trying to feed her formula, and that wasn't working. And my husband was really angry at this time, and he ended up storming through some doors in the emergency room that you're not supposed to, because they're waiting for a breast pump, because they wanted me to pump milk to get to my baby. And there's confusion about that. And that was too far. So the police came and they said, we're taking your kids away. They can't be in my husband's care. They won't let them be in my parents' care. They said, we're taking them. We're putting them in emergency foster care. So my 3-month-old and my 4-year-old went into foster care. And somehow I knew that this was happening. And I was completely calm with it, because in that moment, I accepted that 100% was a God. And he was in control of all this, and somehow it was going to be okay. And he was going to look after everyone. It was fine. And I stayed in that room for 3 days. They locked me in isolation for 3 days. And I've just never been so calm before in my life. It was a really weird experience. So, and they videotape you, I didn't realize this, but they videotape you when you're in that room to diagnose you. And because I was so calm, once they let me out of the room and they put me into the psych ward, they decided, let's not put her on any medication. Let's just see how she is. So I'm pretty sure I was the only person in the entire psych ward who was on no medication at all. And again, just 100% calm. God just completely took care of anything. I can't explain it. It wasn't me. I didn't do anything. I didn't, like you see, I've been a horrible wretch in my life, but I'm pretty sure it was the power of accepting Jesus Christ in my heart without even knowing what that meant yet. God just took care of it. So we ended up, I was held in the psych ward and they ended up releasing me. I just told them the truth about everything. And I got out and we got our kids back in a pretty short order because we completely obeyed the social workers. We were 100% honest. And so this is what really brought me to be a Christian was that when I was in the psych ward, so I knew that I loved Jesus, but I didn't know what this meant yet. And then one day Dr. Alvagio showed up to visit me. And I saw him, and I said, that's it! I'm a Christian, and I'm going to go to his church. So he came, and I thought this though, right? Because I knew that when you're in the psych ward, you have to be really calm. I was not excited in the way that I spoke, because again, the Holy Spirit was showing me what to do, and I had so much gentleness and self-control. So I asked if Dr. Alvagio and I could speak in a private room where I knew they weren't videotaping me, and then that's where I was like, hey, I think I'm a Christian. This weird thing happened with this song, and I go to church now. And he's like, okay, great, come to our service. It's at 9:11 a.m. on Sunday. So I got a pass from the psych nurses, and I went to church. And I was really embarrassed because I still had my psych ward bracelet on. I was probably very disheveled, and I brought my husband and my mom and our two kids because they allowed us to have our visitation here at the church. And it was amazing. The sermon was about forgiveness, and I just felt all the forgiveness in the world for everything that had happened. I mean, we'd even had some social workers tell us that, you know, if we were the social workers on call that night, maybe it wouldn't have gone down that way, or like there was kind of an admittance that it was a bit kind of harsh what happened, but in a way it wasn't, because I had exposed my children to violence and abuse, and this is what happens when you do that, and I just completely accepted it. And we got our children back, and my husband and I started to heal. We went to Dave immediately. I might have still been in the psych ward when I was so fervent at this time. I just didn't care if I looked stupid or weird. I just loved Jesus, and I was desperate to heal my family, and I was just so desperate for my daughters to stop going through this. So we just went to Dave, we told him exactly what was happening, and we asked him if he could help us with marriage counseling, and that's when he gave us the Timothy Keller book. And it was wonderful. You know, and when I was in that hospital, as much as it was really difficult, in some ways it was when I knew God more than ever, because I was alone, I was away from my kids, and I learned a really valuable lesson. And I remember thinking this, I didn't know much, but I knew that Jesus had died on the cross. And I would wake up in the night and I was pumping milk for my daughter, and I would look at these grainy photos of her. This is when she was still in foster care and was in the hospital. And I would just cry. I would miss her so badly. And I missed my kids so badly, and I felt so much remorse and regret for what I had done. But I knew that God had a son, and that he died a horribly uncomfortable death, humiliating death on a cross. And this would console me. And I would just be grateful that at least my girls were still alive. And I learned a really valuable lesson about having children. Those girls do not belong to me. I was their mom, and I had a lot of responsibility in that way. I was failing pretty badly being their mom, but they were children of God. And he could do whatever he saw fit with them. And I was fully obedient to God, and I spent most of my time in the hospital whenever I could, in the prayer room of the hospital, just flat on my face, crying in total gratitude. So, and it was weird. People who knew me as this fierce mama bear, like I would be so angry towards the social workers and stuff, but I just had none of that. It made total sense, and I felt like I just needed to repent 100% completely for what I had done. And through the counseling that we got through Dave, we learned, again, through this Timothy Keller book on marriage, about our own self-centeredness. And often in Western marriages, there comes a point fairly early on where spouses both come to realize how selfish the other person is, and they both conclude that it's the other spouse's selfishness that's the problem in their own. And that was the real root of the problem of why we were exposing our children to this violence between us, right? It was the other person's fault. But here Keller writes that it's especially true if you feel that you've had a hard life and have experienced a lot of hurt. You say silently, okay, I shouldn't have done that, but you don't understand me. And the woundedness makes us minimize our own selfishness. And the Christian way out of the situation is to see your own selfishness as a fundamental problem and to treat it more seriously than you do your spouse's. Because only you have complete access to your own selfishness, and only you have complete responsibility for it. So I practiced this. And following the Bible, knowing that I had Christ, everything stopped. And it's not that there still wasn't problems with my husband and I, but looking at the difficulty between my husband and I through this lens changed everything. I stopped ping-ponging back and forth between trying to be a good girl and denying my anger, suppressing it on the inside. From being that angry feminist, protesting in the streets, vilifying my husband, beating him. Instead, I found that narrow path, and I entered the narrow gate. My anger and sorrow could be expressed to Jesus through prayer. I found comfort in the Psalms, and I could ask Jesus to defend the injustices that I faced, instead of beating my husband and taking the justice into my own hands. And that evil taproot of self-centeredness and selfish ambition that's deeply created my heart, well, it could be pulled up by its roots, and the message of Jesus Christ through the gospel planted in me, well, it let me live a life of servitude to God and others. And the truth I found in the Bible, well, it squelched all the flames of my fiery rage. Because what is anger but entitlement? Entitlement to thinking that whatever's happening to you shouldn't be that way. Well, knowing the truth about this fallen world and the toxic evil that lurks all around us and within every one of us leaves me asking, who am I to think that I could be entitled to be free of harassment, rape, or physical abuse? These innocent, wretched humans were born into sin just like I was. And until that fateful day when Christ returns and puts it all right again, we must learn to live with the cruel injustices of this world with 100% truth and 100% love combined, turning the other cheek and submitting to one another, the way that Christ submitted to the injustice of death and humiliation on the cross. And I have to admit, it's difficult being a Christian. My mouth didn't even want to say the words, I love Jesus. I felt so embarrassed about it at first. But we passionately pursued this way of life because it was the only method that actually worked for us. And we tried everything else, absolutely everything else. But the good Lord tied our hands, and he let us explore every other way to gain joy and peace, but he saved the best for last. The only one that provides real salvation and contentment with this toxic world, a life centered around Christ. In some ways, it's kind of a bummer to be a Christian, right? Like, my friends and family have totally disowned me. And I have a lot less social credit. I don't have any prestige in my community. I quit my job as a promising and popular yoga teacher because God made it very clear in a very powerful sort of supernatural experience that yoga was not a healthy Christian practice. And we faced financial hardship because of that. Right? I'm not as fit or flexible as I used to be. But the truth is none of that even comes close to what I gained. I would rather be unpopular, overweight, stupid, poor, all of that, than lose out on the joy and euphoria that I experienced with total servitude to Master Christ Jesus. I can't even imagine going back to my old life of self-absorption, misery, being alone and cold in this cruel world. So I would give it all up, all of it. And you guys, and some of you might see, sometimes when we're at church and we're singing songs or something, sometimes I just fall to my knees and I cry. And maybe you'll understand now, because you see what God has brought me through and what he's done over and over again in my life. And I'm going to end here with something that Jesus told us, a couple of quotes. One of them is a quote that Jesus told his disciples. And and this is a message for all of us from Jesus, and I have found this to be true over and over again. And so Jesus told his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? So if what Jesus says is true, I hope you've seen that it is over and over again in my life, then that's the only way for you to live as well, whatever that looks like in your life. And I think this quote here really sums it up from my favorite dorky 90s Christian musician, Rich Mullins. He says, God was the enemy of great art, and good taste has to do with being cultured and refined. But one of the reasons I love the Bible is the humans in it are not very refined. They're pretty goofy, actually. And as a depressed teen, people used to say, hey, cheer up, God loves you. Big deal. God loves everyone. That don't make me special. That just proves that God ain't got no taste. And I don't think he does. And that is why he loves all of us so much. Because God takes the junk of our lives and he makes the greatest art in the world out of it. And if he was cultured, if he was as civilized as most Christian people wish he was, he would be useless to Christianity. But God is a wild man. And I hope you hang on for dear life. Or better yet, let go for dear life. And with that, I ask, what are you holding on to? What are you holding on to in this world that's tying up your hands to not let them be open and completely 100% receive the redemptive, miraculous healing power of Jesus Christ in your life? And I just beg you to let go, open your arms, and receive by grace alone the gift that God has in store for every single one of you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Heather, for sharing your story.